All right, good morning and welcome to Patristicast, everyone. Happy Thursday and happy Festivus for my Seinfeld fanatics out there. Today's Festivus, be sure to air your grievances and win your feats of strength. Today, I'm very happy to have on Dr. Peter Martens, Associate Professor. Or are you full professor now? Or are you?
Both.
You're both, okay. Of theology at St. Louis University. Dr. Martens is author of Origin in Scripture, The Contours of the Exegetical Life, and Adrian's Introduction to the Divine Scriptures, an Antioching Handbook of Biblical Exegesis, as well as co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Early Christian Biblical Interpretation. And what's the status on the Oxford Handbook on Origin? Is that coming around?
I believe that's going to be published in the spring. I was a contributor, not an editor.
Okay.
But yes, I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome. Yes, me too. Well, Dr. Martens, welcome to Patristicast. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to be here.
All right. So today we're going to talk about a traditional dichotomy that has stuck around the field of patristics now for, well, going on 200 years, pretty close to it. It's two different ways, two different traditions of biblical exegesis in early Christianity. One coming from the ancient city, the metropolis of Alexandria, Egypt, and the other one from Antioch, which, if I'm not mistaken, I've forgotten this now, would be, what would that be? That'd be like modern day Turkey, right along the border with Syria, correct?
More Syria, yeah. It's on the Orontes River.
Okay, so it's modern Syria. Okay, very good. So, Peter, you're kind of wading into these debates. Before we begin, can you just tell us a little bit about what the traditional line of thought is on the Alexandrian and Antiochene tradition?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, John, for that invitation and for setting it up this way. As you mentioned, this idea of the Alexandrian and Antiochene schools, this concept, this goes back some time. It was really in the 1860s and 1870s when this idea seems to have really become popular. I've counted no fewer than 7 monographs that were published in Germany in about a 15-year window here in the 1860s and 1870s. Monographs that had Antiochene, Alexandrian, school, schola in the title. And by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, and certainly in the early 20th century, this concept seems to have really taken hold. It's in the encyclopedias, the handbooks, the monographs, and it more or less means something like this. Antioch stands for sober-minded, literal, historical, biblical interpretation, attentive to the details of the biblical text. Antioch, on the other hand, stands for extravagant, undisciplined, allegorical interpretation. Mm-hmm. The concept is intended to be descriptive, but for many authors, it's pretty clear that it's also normative. Mm-hmm. The idea here is that Antioch is a precursor of modern historical critical biblical interpretation. Mm-hmm. It's something we want to do. And Alexandria is something we want to avoid. Mm-hmm. It's not Wissenschaft as we understand it in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mm-hmm. So this is the concept, Antiochene and Alexandrian biblical interpretation. And like I said, it really takes hold and gets expressed in all kinds of avenues. And it's still with us to this day. Mm-hmm. Now, anecdotally, my feeling when I talk to scholars today about this issue is that people break down into 3 camps. You've got those who still think this traditional concept works and they defend it. And then you have those on the other hand of the spectrum who are convinced we need to do away with it. It's deeply flawed. Mm-hmm. And then there's a group in the middle that I think is quite uncertain about what to do with it. There's a big question mark. They'll refer to the so-called Antiochene schools. They hedge their bets. And so I think that's where we are today. The field has not settled on what to do with this anymore. And I'm hoping that our brief conversation today can at least give some direction to where the scholarship might go on this.
Yeah, that's a helpful way of looking at it. The way I kind of think about it is that, if you say something enough, it almost becomes fact, and people just regurgitate it when they can. And the Antiochene Alexandrian dichotomy seems to me to be one of those things that it's been said enough times that it almost becomes dogma. And of course, like you say, it's being challenged now. But I do think that there are some confessional issues at play with it too. Like you say, perhaps normative rather than confessional is a better way to put it. Because like you say, the reaction against the Alexandrian use of allegory or symbolic interpretation is that it's excessive. It doesn't really appreciate the history of the biblical text. It's it's off the rails in a certain way. It strikes me that kind of reminds me of the Hellenization of Christianity debate too, where there's a pure form of Christianity that's unadulterated, that's not corrupted by Hellenism. And then with someone like Harnack, the patristics kind of gets corrupted by this Platonic sensibility. It strikes me as something very similar to that, where if you say it enough times, people just accept it as truth.
Yep. Well, that's a good point, John, because often in that conversation, the Hellenization of Christianity, it is precisely this Alexandrian school with its allegory that is brought in as evidence for how Christianity loses its way, how it moves away from its native Palestinian soil and somehow becomes corrupted. And yeah, it's part of that larger conversation as well. So there's a lot at stake in thinking this issue through carefully.
Yep, that's right. That's right. So for the people who don't know much about this subject, we've talked about the geography. So Alexandria, it's like northwestern Egypt on the Mediterranean coast. Antioch, modern day Syria. Who are some of the major players now in each camp?
Yeah, cast of characters, as it were.
Cast of characters, that's right. Yep.
On the Alexandrian side, Origen is always listed. And working backwards, as it were, Clement of Alexandria will be brought into the conversation. And interestingly, Philo is often put in that camp as well. And I think that the more the Alexandrian school becomes understood as an exegetical phenomenon, the easier it is to pull Philo in as an allegorist. The more the Alexandrian school becomes viewed as a Christological tendency, then Philo tends not to make it into the cast. But certainly you have Origen and Clement. Where is Eusebius? Eusebius is sometimes in as someone who took care of eventually Origen's library in Caesarea Maritima and clearly read Origen. Didymus the Blind may or may not be in that camp as well, also an Alexandrian. Athanasius and Cyril can get put into the Alexandrian school, but Athanasius is trickier because he does not leave behind a lot of commentaries and homilies on the biblical text. And Cyril's biblical interpretation is not patently Origenian. So it's not always clear who belongs in that camp. On the Antiochene side, I would say there's more clarity. A convenient place to start is with Diodor of Tarsus and an otherwise unknown Carterius, who were head of an institution in Antioch that taught the Bible. You have John Chrysostom, certainly Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodore's brother, Polychronius, and Adrian, who read Theodore closely, a Julian of Eclanum, who translated Theodore. Sometimes Theodoret is put into this group as well. And then also we can work backwards and we can say, well, probably Eustathius of Antioch, and Eusebius of Amasa should also be considered part of this tradition. Certainly their commentaries were read by Diodore and Theodore.
Now,
Those are rough characters.
And Chrysostom is an interesting figure, as you note in your essay. He's kind of in, but he's kind of out.
He's his own man.
Yeah,
and I think he's his own man in a lot of ways. Yeah. I hesitate to put John into the Antioching exegetical school. He seems to be more distant from some of the other people I mentioned. The other people, you can show very tight connections. They either knew one another personally. Well, John knew some of these people personally, but there are deeper similarities between, say, an Adrian and a Theodore, an Adrian, a Theodore, and a Diodore, and then a John. When you compare John's interpretation of a verse to these other authors, John is doing something different.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, the rivalry can be overstated a little bit, because Chrysostom, he gave refuge to some Origenist monks as they were pretty much exiled from Egypt. So he was kind of embroiled in the Origenist controversy in that regard too. But he wouldn't really, he wouldn't be an Origenist himself. So he, like you say, he kind of did his own thing. He didn't really seem to be bound too much.
Right. And I think this is where, as we're talking about the cast of characters and struggling to identify, okay, who really belongs and who doesn't, this is where we start to get at the contemporary criticisms of this traditional construct. There are a number of problems that scholars have raised with the traditional construct as it came out of the 19th century. And I think they're quite legitimate, the criticisms. And so could I mention some of those here as we move?
Absolutely, yes, please.
So one of them has to do with these very geographic labels. So to consider Origen the quintessential Alexandrian makes a lot of sense, but as you and I and the viewers know, Origen spent a significant part of his career not in Alexandria, but in Caesarea Maritima. And the influence of Origen is arguably far greater in the Latin West than it is in his own city, Alexandria. So it can be a bit misleading to call this an Alexandrian tradition. And also on the flip side, it can be really misleading to call it an Antiochene tradition when we look at Theodore of Mopsuestia. His writings were rendered into Latin, into Syriac. They crossed linguistic and political boundaries very quickly. So whatever we mean by this Antiochene tradition, it clearly is much bigger than the Diocese of Antioch. And so this is one of the criticisms that scholars have raised, that these geographic labels are a bit confusing. I think it's also another legitimate criticism is that it's not helpful to associate Alexandria with allegory. When we look at Origen's writings on the Bible, he certainly allegorizes, and he uses a wide vocabulary to talk about allegory. But he doesn't only do that. His commentary on the Pauline letter correspondence, he never allegorizes Paul. Or if he does, it would be the exception that proves the rule. I haven't found an example. And when we look at the Hexapla, which was a monumental effort that he and presumably fellow scribes put this together. I mean, the Hexapla, this multi-columned edition of the Old Testament, which isn't doing allegory or literal interpretation. He's putting the biblical text in columns to compare readings with one another. So it's a very slapdash label that doesn't capture at all the complexities of what Origen and Alexandria are doing. And on the Theodore side, the Antiochene side, we see Theodore doing symbolic exegesis too in his catechetical homilies. And so these very simplistic descriptions break down quite quickly. And then when we get into the real details and start comparing how these authors read the biblical text, we realize that there's a lot of similarity. They use the same vocabulary when they describe what they're doing. They talk about paying attention to the sequence of the text, akoutheia. Pay attention to the intent, the skopos, of what the author, the biblical author, is doing. They can interpret biblical passages in exactly the same way. So Jesus' clearing of the temple in the Gospel of John, both Origen and Theodore interpreted symbolically of the future destruction of the temple. Same interpretation.
Yep.
And even deeper, and I think, to me, this is where it gets really interesting, is authors on both sides get nervous about the same things in the Bible. So they get really nervous about how the Bible can portray God in ways that seem absurd, blasphemous. God's eyes, God's hands, God's feet. And authors on both sides rescue God from these portrayals and try to show that this is not what the Bible's talking about. And so I think part of the scholarly pushback then is to say, there are a lot of similarities between authors in these traditions. How much difference really is there? And I think these are all very legitimate criticisms. And I think this is where simply rehashing the old 19th century concept probably isn't useful anymore. We have to find a new way to articulate it.
Well, I wonder if a related question too is how we define the word school.
Yeah.
Because these are often, not just tradition, but the Antiochene school or the Alexandrian school. And what do we mean when we call these traditions schools? I don't know.
Yeah. I think that's where some of the confusion has crept in, because school is an ambiguous word in English and probably in a lot of other languages too. If we mean by school a learning environment associated with a particular instructor, there was obviously a school in Alexandria. Origen is teaching people in Alexandria, and at a certain point he splits his classroom up. The beginners, Heraclius teaches the beginners, he gets the advanced pupils. We know that when Origen goes to Caesarea, he has a school. And on the Antiochene side, I mentioned beforehand that Diodor and Carterius are leaders of an institution that in Greek is called the asketerion. We're not entirely sure how to translate that word, but instruction is happening there. So in that sense, it should not at all be controversial to talk about schools in Alexandria and Antioch. The problem we have as scholars is, how do we reconstruct these schools?
That's right.
We don't know the academic calendar. We don't know the syllabi, the courses that were taught. I mean, we have some vague ideas, but what were the learning goals? How long did people study with? Sort of to reconstruct these learning environments is extremely difficult, and I would say nearly impossible given the evidence that survives. The most you could do is make educated guesses. So that's one idea of school. There's another idea that the school is a group of people who share similar ideas, approaches, or styles to something. The way we might talk about a school of painters. Or a school of novelists. There are resemblances. And I think this is the way in which it makes a lot more sense to talk about an Alexandrian school and an Antiochene school. There are clusters of authors who seem to know one another, or if they don't know one another, they read each other's works. And the works they are reading are clearly shaping their own projects. And I think that is probably a more useful way to conceptualize the Alexandrian and Antiochene traditions or schools. These are groups of like-minded scholars who read one another's works, who are influenced by each other, and are recognizable to us in that way.
Yes. Now, you make an interesting point in this essay that I read from you on the Antiochene school. When we talk about the Antiochenes, we're in a post-Constantinian church. So the church has gained not just a lot of steam, but recognition within the Roman Empire. They've gained a lot more freedom to do their business, so to speak. Whereas with Origen, we're dealing with pre-Constantine. And you tie this in with audience. So in the post-Constantinian church, the church is reaching out to a wider array of people who perhaps don't really have the biblical background that somebody in Origin school would have had, or the philosophical background that somebody in Origin school would have had. Can you talk about, because when we talk about schools, we have to think about not just the teachers and the institution, but who are the learners, who are the people being taught. Can you say a little bit about that? That was a very interesting point you made in that essay.
Well, I think I like the way you just put it. It's spot on. It's important that we not only attend to the instructor, the writer, but also try to imagine who is the audience. So, with Origen, at least in Eusebius's account of Origen's life in Book 6 of the Ecclesiastical History, Eusebius gives us some very interesting detail about Origen. That Origen, when he became so popular and attracted so many students, Alexander, he broke his classroom up. Heraclius took the more beginning students. Origen got the more advanced students. And we're told there that Origen is often teaching philosophy and teaching philosophers. And when we have in the panegyric of Gregory that describes in very broad brushstrokes, not a lot of detail, what Origen was doing in Caesarea Maritima later on in his career, the picture is more or less corroborated. Origen is dealing with advanced topics for advanced pupils. And when we read his commentaries and even his homilies, it's really hard not to come away with the impression that Origen's audiences are advanced. Origen has no problem jumping into abstruse philosophical topics. He has no problem engaging in debates with contemporary church intellectuals and leaders. How do you conceive of the relationship between the Son and the Father? He has no problem allegorizing biblical texts, which the simpler, as he refers them, the simpler people in his world are very nervous about. And so Origen just conveys a high level of learning for an advanced audience. When we look at the scholarship that Antioching authors produce, it reads and feels very different. So they spend a lot of time going over basic words that would be unfamiliar. So they gloss difficult terms. They identify figures of speech for their readers. Here is ellipsis. Here is tautology. Here's how we define these figures of speech. And now let me illustrate them. They list tropes. This is metaphor. This is hyperbole. They define them. They give summaries and overviews of biblical books. They write handbooks for teachers that are designed to help beginning students clear the basic hurdles into the biblical text. Everything conveys a beginning audience. And so, to me, this is an important observation, if it is correct. I don't know of too many other people who are making this argument. It's an argument I'm making. If it's correct, I think one of the implications is that we don't see Alexandria and Antioch as rival approaches to the biblical text. It's probably better to envision them not as competitors or rivals, but as projects that originated at different points in Christian history for different audiences, and actually quite capable of being viewed as compatible with one another. And I think the later exegetical tradition bears this out. In the Catena which excerpt previous biblical commentators, we see the Catenists happily juxtaposing allegorical interpretations with these Antiochene interpretations. And I don't think the idea here is that we have conflict, is that we have supplements to one another. These are multiple ways of engaging the text for people who have achieved different levels of understanding. So that to me would seem to be a productive way forward for thinking about the relationship between these schools or traditions.
So at the beginning, you talked about the three camps. There's the traditional camp, which sees a complete dichotomy. They're irreconcilable. And then you got the, I don't think he used the word, but maybe deconstructionists who say, well, no, that doesn't work anymore. We have to completely tear that down. And then there's people in the middle. You would kind of place yourself somewhere in the middle. You see perhaps that there's still some utility of talking about Alexandrian and Antiochene schools, but perhaps not in the same way that the 19th century Germans did.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I see myself as coming out of that middle. I too, for a long time, sort of wrestling. What are we doing with this concept? And I'm not sure about it. I see people that are prolific and accomplished scholars endorsing something that approaches a traditional view, and then I see very prolific and accomplished scholars expressing tremendous skepticism. What do we do? And so, for me, the path forward emerged when I was doing my edition of Adrian. And Adrian was a very close and careful reader of Theodore of Mopsuestia. And as I was doing the edition and working on the notes that tried to explain to people what Adrian was up to, I discovered in the process that Adrian was often borrowing verbatim from predecessors, especially Theodore's commentary on the Psalms. He never mentions Theodore, but he is clearly using him. He's clearly borrowing from him. And it became clear to me that, no, there is a way to think about an Antiochene tradition, but I don't want to think about it as simply tied to an institution of learning in Antioch that died or ran. And I certainly don't want to think about it in these vague ways as doing literal or historical scholarship. That doesn't make, I don't know how to define those, and people can't agree on how to define that. To me, the evidence for the Antiochene tradition was that you actually see authors repeating one another's interpretations of the biblical text. To me, if that's not a school, if that's not a tradition, what is?
Right.
And so that's how I started reconstructing a more usable version of this 19th century concept. There are so many examples of authors borrowing from one another, of taking over their interpretations. And you don't just see this in Antioch. We know this on the Origenian side. I mean, Eusebius is taking Origen over, Jerome, Ambrose, so many authors who are reading him, either in Greek or in Latin translation, are using him. Bernard of Clairvaux's homilies on the Song of Songs, right? So this to me is a way to think about these traditions moving forward, not with these vague methodological brushstrokes. Well, that's an allegorist, that's a literal person. So if you're allegorical, you must be Alexandrian. If you are literal, you must be Antiochene. No, let's actually look at how people are interpreting actual verses. And then let's construct the tradition out of that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that Origen, as an allegorist, often gets accused of disregarding biblical history. When you read his commentary on John, for example, I think it's in book 6, where he talks about John the Baptist coming in the spirit and power of Elijah. He reacts to people who are using that as a proof text for the transmigration of souls. So Elijah was reincarnated in the person of John the Baptist. He wants to refute that argument completely. And instead he situates that whole discourse in early John with Jewish messianic expectations, which strikes me as a kind of a historical reading, but that's not his main concern. He uses it to refute people who are arguing for reincarnation. But even in Origen, you do get historical considerations, even if it's not his primary concern.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think Origen got himself into a bit of trouble with later readers, with a couple, with his argument in book 4 of On First Principles, where he becomes hyperbolic. he talks about thousands and thousands of passages in the Bible which cannot be taken at face value. Right? They either narrate things that could not have happened. Is there really a serpent that talks?
Yeah.
Is there a tree that you could eat its fruit and get knowledge? Like, dear reader, please tell me where these things are in our reality, right? What mountain did the devil lead Jesus up to that Jesus could see all the kingdoms of the world, right? So Origen he identifies these passages in biblical narratives that can't be factual. And then he has these hyperbolic, there are thousands and thousands of other passages like this. Well, we know from reading Origen's homilies and commentaries that he is actually rarely quite skeptical about whether narratives report on events. He actually thinks they're generally quite reliable for reporting on events. But his later readers seize on the hyperbole and turn it against Origen, as if this is what allegory always was doing, as if allegorists were repeatedly denying the historicity of what biblical narratives spoke to. And we, in fact, know that this is not what Origen was doing.
Perhaps as we draw this conversation to a close soon in the next little bit, I can ask you about the implication this has for Christian institutions in late antiquity, because we're talking about schools. We're talking about whether we talk about centers of learning or schools of thought. Christianity is reaching out to a more erudite audience, and we're seeing the emergence of a Christian intellectual tradition, or maybe perhaps diverse Christian intellectual traditions. Wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Does our thought about institutions, I'm thinking primarily of Christoph Markschies's book, Christian Theology and Its Institutions, whether that might also help us to explain what's happening at this time, because you're talking with the Antioching tradition, how Adrian is reading and borrowing from Theodore Mopsuestia. Are institutions forming how they think? Is the Antioching tradition, is that forming readers how to think and approach the biblical text in a unique way?
So unique, that's a big word. I'm not sure I want to go that far.
Sure.
But I think for me, one of the takeaways in the last few years has been that, well, it's extremely difficult sometimes to reconstruct the institutions and the audiences in which biblical interpretation took place. We have to try. I think we have greatly underestimated the extent to which institution and audience shape what people are doing with the biblical text. And it would be a very interesting framework to use when we want to change the metaphor, map out the diversity of early Christian biblical interpretation, rather than trying to map it out in terms of, genres of interpretation, rather than trying to use methods of interpretation to create this map or framework. Could we think about biblical interpretation in terms of differing audiences? So what does it look like when you're teaching children in the home?
Yes.
Gregory of Nazianzus has little biblical poems. So other end of the spectrum, what does it look like when you're teaching students in a philosophical classroom? Well, this is where Origen and Didymus the Blind belong. What does it look like when you're teaching the Bible in a monastic setting? What does it look like when you're teaching the Bible to kids who are in the grammarian stage of formation? The thing is, we could probably do some interesting research on this by just looking at how some book like the Psalms, which was interpreted intensively, you could just look at Psalm exegesis and ask this question, and I think create a very interesting spectrum of commentaries, homilies, and handbooks. So this is something that I think is a project worth pursuing. I think another sort of implication is, how do we imagine networks between our authors? in late antiquity? What are these networks? It would be really interesting to put together, say, a larger digital humanities style project that maps the network of these Antiochene scholars from the 4th through 6th centuries and maybe beyond, and to show what links exist, where do the links exist, what kind of links exist, to demonstrate that these authors really are working in an interconnected universe. These are not independent ivory tower scholars producing their own works of creative genius. I mean, there is that, but they are also working very much in an interconnected world. And I don't think we have sufficient understanding and appreciation for how interconnected this world was. And I think biblical interpretation becomes a wonderful way to start linking authors to one another, because they aren't ultimately linked just this way. There are all kinds of other themes that pull authors together because they are reading one another's works widely.
Yeah, that reminds me of the correspondence between Origen and Julius Africanus. At the end of Julius's letter, he says, I wish you and Ambrose, and he lists a series of names of people that are associated with Origen in Caesarea. And then in Origen's response, or he says something like, we send you greetings from here. Julius is writing in Jerusalem. And he's got a list of names of people who are associated with him. So already you have two, like you have a network, of two different communities close geographically, Caesarea and Jerusalem, maybe 90 minutes apart on the road today. But that does raise these questions, how did they network? What did these relationships look like? Because they weren't just isolated figures, like you said. They're communicating with people. They have friends, just like we do today. Scholars have friends, and professors have students, and networks.
I think, it's. I think it's an interesting project to pursue, and I think what would also, and this would be another way in which we would start moving beyond the traditional Alexandrian and Antiochene construct, is we would ultimately discover in this process that we have major figures who each operate in networks that are not always overlapping. And so it may ultimately become more useful to talk about an Origenian tradition, an Antiochene tradition, a Eusebian tradition, of course, an Augustinian tradition. John Chrysostom generates an enormous tradition. That we are not dealing with two things, and because this is what older scholars did, is they said, well, there's only two approaches to the Bible: allegory or literal, and every early Christian author has to get rammed into one of these categories. And so you would see very, to me, incredibly bizarre claims, like Augustine is an Antiochene. Like, what? I mean, that also has to be left behind. I think we have to recognize that we have very powerful intellectual forces, multiple nodes in early Christianity that generate connections to their own networks, but then also overlapping. And to do a project like this that would show people who the major interpreters are and what kind of networks they had would be interesting. We'd probably discover, I'm going to say, between 6 and 9 major biblical scholars in the early church who were the center of a major network.
Yeah, I think that's about right. Sounds like a great way to move the conversation forward, that's for sure.
Always trying. Always trying.
Always trying, that's right. That's what we do.
Yeah.
All right, Peter. Well, thank you very much for joining Patristicast. This was a delightful conversation.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about things that matter to me, and in this case to us. We both work in this area, so I appreciate the chance to chat with folks, and I hope that the video is useful to people.
I am confident it will be. I get some good comments on these, so I think this will be one right up there with the rest of them.
Wonderful, wonderful.
All right, well, happy Festivus and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
You as well. Nice transition to the new year for all of us.
Yep.